Well, you're still watching this morning's broadcast here on News Central Television. This is News Now with me, Joe Hansen. Let's take a look at the top stories for this hour. Vice President of Nigeria, Kashim Shettima, pushes for buoyant economy for Africa. Striking doctors challenge of FCT Minister Wike, Senate President Akpabio to use local hospitals. And in Mozambique, journalist dies after alleged beaten by security forces. Do want to stay with us to get details of these stories and many more in a moment. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Joe Hansen. Let's take a look at these stories right now. Let's start by telling you that Vice President Kashim Shettima has reiterated Nigeria's readiness to spearhead AfCFTA African Continental Free Trade Area while taking advantage of the market potential of the sector for economic integration of the continent. He joined other world leaders to push for the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area with a target to boost Africa's economy to $29 trillion by 2050. This is just as the president of the ongoing World Economic Forum, George Brandy, pointed out the transformative potential of the AfCFTA, projecting that its full implementation could boost Africa's economy to $29 trillion by 2050. The vice president and other global leaders declared their nation's positions at a forum of friends at the summit in Davos, Switzerland.
The worst cause that the Chinese may wish for you is for you to live in interesting times. And indeed, globally, we are living in interesting times. Armed conflicts, from the crisis in Ukraine, the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, to the war, the unfortunate war in Sudan, has further compounded our misery as a people. That disrupted supply chains exacerbated our humanitarian challenges and threatened global peace. And as John Donne said, every man's death diminishes me. So never send to know the hope the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So I believe the armed conflicts in Africa is further compounding our challenges for development. There is an incestuous relationship between economy and ecology in the African continent. Sudan, which used to be a standard bearer for peace and development in West Africa, in Central Africa, and in all of Africa, has become a basket case. But I believe hope springs eternal from the hearts of men. We believe that collectively, as members of the same human family, we can find solutions to our challenges.
Well, away from Davos now, let's head straight to another story. Residents of Agum Bukuma community in Degama local government area, River State, are still reeling from the devastating fire caused by a crude oil spill. The disaster has left the community in distress, with 4 casualties reportedly recorded. News Central's Austin Azu visited the scene and filed this report.
Behind me is the impact of the fire at Zion City, a satellite community in Bukuma, River State. People have lost their houses, people have lost their economic lives, and of course you can still see the ravaging fire from the oil wellhead that is still ravaging to this moment.
This place, as you can see, these are where fishermen, farmers settled.
Residents of Bukuma are struggling to cope with the aftermath of a massive fire, which has ravaged homes and livelihoods. The traditional ruler of Agum Bukuma Kingdom, Walami Akim X, said the crude oil spill began on 21st December 2024 and escalated into a fire that engulfed parts of his kingdom. He provided an updated casualty count from the tragedy.
The 3 local governments in Calabar is affected. Bukuma is the worst because they are where the oil well is existing. 4 have died.
Survivors also shared their harrowing experiences and appealed for urgent assistance to help them rebuild their lives.
So both aquatic and terrestrial life is altered. Wells are polluted. the atmosphere, the troposphere is charged with hydrocarbon. We have cases of cough, amnesia, and different kinds of skin irritation.
Government go pay the house because now them do this, you know.
The fire connect for our place there, so they find to pack the things them. At the I bring out the things, they cannot the fire already ran me half of my leg. Now they are what take run. Our things them born, I leave the things they run. Everything born finish.
It's for the government to come in and effect whatever things that they need, they think should be done for the people as it ought to be.
The Director General of the National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency alleged third-party involvement in the disaster following a site visit and comprehensive assessment of its causes with stakeholders and specialized personnel. But this environmentalist is calling for immediate compensation and remediation to tackle the ongoing fire and its environmental consequences.
It is so insensitive for someone in government to come out to say compensation will not be paid. Communities do not have the power to secure oil infrastructure. That belongs to government and the company. If you fail in your duty, then you should bear the consequences of whatever the outcome is.
The fire, which has raged for over 3 weeks, has devastated aquatic life, destroyed farmland and contaminated the community's only source of drinking water. In Agum Bukuma, River State for News Central, I'm Austin Azu.
Well, earlier, the spokesperson to the chairman of Degama local government area, Gloria Boma Harry, was on News Central, where she stated that locals in the community had no hand in causing the fire, contrary to claims by the NNPCL that the fire outbreak was a result of vandalism.
Correct, because the spokesman, Pastor Alex Fubara, told us yesterday when we went there that the oil wells, they have about 13 oil wells in that community. And from what he told us, he said there's no maintenance of such oil wells. So this oil well, actually the wellhead actually blew as a result of wear and tear, not because they were vandalized, no. So he said there's need for NNPCL to immediately come assess the oil wells within that community and maintain them, because maybe we could wake up one morning and find other wellheads also blowing up. So the people are actually afraid for their safety because they've said NNPCL has neglected this oil well. So we don't know how true it is. So it's left for NNPCL to come out to their own side of the story. But as for vandalism, no.
All the way from River State now, let's go to stories concerning the Minister of Power, Adebayo Adelabu, who has cleared the air on the allocation of the 8 billion naira in the ministry's 2025 budget, saying it is for the provision of technology to protect power infrastructure. Adelabu was responding to media reports that the ministry plans to spend 8 billion naira on electricity bill sensitization. In a statement on Thursday by Bolaji Tunji, Special Advisor to the Minister on Strategic Communications and Media Relations, Adelabu said the amount is specifically meant for advocacy, education, enlightenment and provision of technology to protect power infrastructure. According to the minister, the budgeted amount is meant to sensitize Nigerians on the need to show patriotism in their attitudes and conduct towards national assets, especially power infrastructure. Let's also tell you that striking resident doctors in the Federal Capital Territory have called on FCT Minister Nyesom Wike and Senate President Godswill Akpabio to utilize government hospitals in Abuja to experience the challenges faced by public health workers and patients. The doctors began a 3-day warning strike on Wednesday over unpaid salaries, allowances and other grievances following the expiration of a 3-week ultimatum issued earlier. President of the Association of Resident Doctors in the FCT, George Ebong, criticized Wike for neglecting the state of healthcare facilities and workers' welfare in Abuja. He noted that while Wike has focused on fixing roads, many health institutions in the nation's capital remain in a deplorable state. Let's go now to politics. A former spokesperson of the New Nigeria People's Party, NNPP, Musa Nuhu Yankaba, has said that the former Kano State Governor Rabiu Kwankwaso and the incumbent Governor Abba Yusuf do not belong to the authentic NNPP. Yankaba asserted that the faction using the fruit logo represents the original NNPP. It disclosed that Kwankwaso recently led a group within the party to change its logo to a book symbol, a move he described as illegitimate. He also referred to a ruling by an Abia State Court on November 1, 2024, which recognized Boniface's faction as the legitimate leadership of the NNPP. Well, today marks the final day of the 2025 World Economic Forum taking place in Davos, Switzerland. Around 6 billion people inhabit middle-income homes. And talking about income countries, I beg your pardon, yet growth in many of these economies is either stagnating or slowly due to global disruptions. What strategies can leaders employ to challenge the status quo and address a premature showdown in development? Well, these are some of the conversations that would be going on currently as we speak at the World Economic Forum taking place in Davos, Switzerland, especially on its final day. Bring to you more clips on the live broadcast of what's happening right there in Davos, Switzerland. We'll get to join them once more. But let's move on now to our very next story. It's got to do with police kidnappers and security matters. Key stakeholders in Plateau State have been urged to build on the peace achieved so far and to focus on improving these successes for the greater development of the state. These were the parting words of the General Officer commanding 3 Armored Division and Commander of Operation Safe Haven, Major General Abdul Salam Abubakar, during an expanded stakeholders engagement marking the end of his tenure. News Central's Chizoba reports. All right, we'll bring that package to you in our subsequent news bulletin. But let's go on a quick break. When we come back, we'll bring to you more stories here on News Now. Welcome back to News Now. Well, let's take you straight to Switzerland, where we are indeed being joined by the ongoing conversation right now in Davos, of course, the World Economic Forum. Let's take you there right away.
With a Keynesian and increasing returns to scale view of investment. Those pioneers in the 50s and 60s were asking the right questions. When we got to the 1990s, we stopped asking the right questions. We just said, you know, get government out of the way, balance your macro, and let investment fall where it may. We cannot follow that now. I mean, it was never convincing then, but at the moment, we have to see the investment in key areas of infrastructure. It's not let investment fall where it may. They're really priority areas in our infrastructure, in our energy, in our transport, in our cities, and our land. So we really do have to rethink policy, rethink the role of the state. And to conclude where Masood concluded, if we are able to get behind the investment, particularly in the developing world that we need, that new approach, that new path of development in our hands is enormously attractive. And it will be fast, it will be rapid development. The multilateral development banks and the private sector will be absolutely key in providing the finance for that story. It will be the host countries that create the environment where that investment can take place and will define the investment that needs to be supported. So we have an investment imperative and an investment opportunity, and the next 20 years could be great, or the next 20 years could really undermine the future for our children and grandchildren.
Right. Being a minister in this era of unknowns is indeed, it's not an easy task. For Minister Adun, you have gone through some sort of like a focal point of a reform agenda in Nigeria, a lot on your shoulders. By looking at the rate that Nigeria is going, I understand the fact that it's not easy to deploy the art of balancing act here, right? Given by these two major overviews by Mr. Masood Ahmed as well as Lord Stern, as a minister, how do you navigate this particular situation?
Thank you very much, and of course I'm honored to be on this very distinguished panel. And what Mr. Massoud and Lord Stern have said really resonates, the urgency and the trust that needs to be built. Because if I start, we are describing Nigeria and other African countries as middle-income countries, and I think if you look up the if you look up the definition of a middle-income country, it goes from like $1,000 per income per head, all the way to 12,000. So we're very much at the lower end of that scale, and we're faced with a situation where, if you look at the global context now, if you look at the heightened risks from in the trade sector, in terms of world trade, in terms of the conflicts, and the other, and of course, climate action, the events that are occupying the minds of the global leaders, the Western world, we very much are in a situation where what we need to do to get our people out of poverty, we have to take responsibility ourselves. And how do we do it? And what are we committing ourselves to? And what have we been committing ourselves to? The right policies to stabilize our economies, attract domestic and foreign investment, increase productivity, grow the economies, create jobs, and move our people out of poverty. In Nigeria, we are about 18 months into a reform program which essentially turned us away from unstable, inefficient macroeconomic policies, particularly expensive and wasteful subsidies that were draining, not just draining the economy, but were also sending the wrong signals in terms of the incentives for investors and for key operators in the economy. The cost early on of reform is always going to come before the benefits. And the cost came in terms of relatively heightened cost of living, high inflation, and that clearly is of major concern. And in order to address that, safety nets have been put in place, direct benefits such as were done during COVID. But the key is to, and we have started seeing some of those benefits, the key is having the economy stable. The debt servicing to GDP is coming down. The deficit as a percentage of GDP is coming down. And so we're on that track to take advantage of the natural resources we have, of the demographic dividend which we can earn. And I must say that in the time this week at Davos, we have had a stream of investors who a year ago would, because of the illiquidity in the foreign exchange market and other such constraints, would not have looked at the Nigerian economy, and they're now coming in one by one, obviously, first of all, in the oil sector, but also in the non-oil sector, in infrastructure. And we take note of what Lord Stern said about the right type of infrastructure that will be sustainable and that will not lock us into a bad situation. But across the board, we are optimistic that with the right policies, we can encourage private sector investment in particular to get the economy growing and to help reduce poverty in our country.
Yeah, looking at the rate that we are going, I want to talk about help. Then I think best to touch on the development finance institutions, or DFI, especially on the role of DFI, just to make sure that we have to avoid the trap into ineffectiveness. So I would like to turn to Ms. Batumelo Masako. From your perspective of leapfrogging, right, and to newer, more efficient technologies, and how can the banking sector drive economic and social growth?
Okay, thank you, and for the opportunity to be on this panel with the esteemed At the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we regard development as building Africa's prosperity. And we do that through infrastructure investment. Our value proposition is we plan infrastructure, we prepare infrastructure, we fund infrastructure, we build and we maintain, because we're also of the view that you cannot build without taking care of what you already have. And this is very key to us because we focus on sectors that enable economic growth, and that is energy, ensuring energy security through energy investment, transportation, making sure that transportation is efficient, digital infrastructure, and that is very topical at the moment, that we ensure that there is resilient communication and there's also digital inclusion. Water sector as well, access to water, access to affordable housing, healthcare, and education. So these are key sectors that we focus on as a development finance institution. Now, when you look at the opportunity around this on the continent, I mean, we are in a continent that needs to spend, between 90 and 100 $1 billion annually to close the infrastructure gap. There's a World Bank report, I think it was a 2019 report, that says countries need to spend between 2% and 8% of their GDP on infrastructure. And this goes to capital formation. As countries need to be intentional and deliberate about their infrastructure development to enable the necessary economic growth that is required. The second thing that we need to look at is capacity building and capability building. I mean, even within our mandate, there's socio-economic development and capacity building. So making sure that as countries, we have the right skills, and they must also be relevant. And I mean, even when you look at the theme at the World Economic Forum, we are in a digital age, and it's important for us that as a continent, when we leverage our demographic, our youth demographic, we ensure that we support the youth with those relevant digital skills. The third thing that we focus on is the issue around smart partnerships, collaboration, coordinated partnerships. What is key there is the importance of private sector participation in infrastructure development. And this goes back to what my panelists have touched on, issues around creating an enabling environment for private sector participation. This is key because, governments alone cannot go at it. It has to be a collaborative effort between the private sector and the public sector. The role of the government is to ensure that they create an enabling environment. I will give you an example with South Africa. In 2011, we started our independent IPP program, renewable program. What that program has done is, it was driven by policy, providing offtakes by government. It actually enabled private sector to participate in green, cleaner energy sources. We currently have installed capacity between solar and wind at 8, I think it's between 7.5 and 8 gigawatts, and an investment that was driven just by creating an enabling environment. Following that, when we faced our energy constraints in South Africa, the government decided to do an energy reform, enabling self-generation, increasing the level of self-generation. What then happened? The private sector then actually started investing in cleaner technologies and actually generating their own power. So for us to really, in reimagining development, we're seeing it as, focusing on infrastructure development, the networks sectors that I mentioned. It's going to be critical that, there is collaboration between the public and the private sector, and skilling is really going to be at the heart of it.
Yeah, I could see that happening currently in Bangladesh as well. Mr. Siddiqui, led by Chief Advisor Dr. Muhammad Yunus, in which he's trying very hard to actually making sure this dynamic between the private and the government sector to create the whole environment for the new path of growth in Bangladesh. Is that the case in Bangladesh?
Well, thank you, Ash. Maybe I should start by sharing a bit of the reality check that has been gifted to us by the uprising in Bangladesh last summer. I think we learned, and again, without taking away the achievements of Bangladesh over multiple decades, that certainly in recent years, an obsession with headline GDP growth numbers has masked imbalances underneath, which have then exposed the lack of resilience to the development model. So the fact that GDP is not only reductionist, but it can be dangerous if not looked in its context, this was brought into sharp relief. If I think of just what were the deficiencies, three very quick ones. The first one is that it has not been inclusive in any sense of the word. Inclusive in the process of policymaking, inclusive in the fruits of policymaking. And I think the lesson for the world at large is that you exclude at your peril if you're not taking that as a design consideration. The second is that we didn't really look at the second order effects. The drivers of growth, everyone talks about infrastructure as being required, but heavy infrastructure, mega projects are also conduits of mega looting, huge corruption in that space. But you see the visible construct, the bridges and the roads, and you probably ignore the economic crime that can get away underneath it. And thirdly, I think we do not spend enough time looking at government and governance institutions as being part of the problem. We are part of the problem by design, not just an exogenous thing that the rest of the economy will have to work with. We have to, I don't like the word in general, but decolonize extractive institutions that operate in very modern ways. The instruments, the institutions of governance, they need to be changed in very practical ways. And you mentioned the new trilemma, the buzzword here in Davos. It echoes to me the three zeros that Professor Muhammad Yunus has been talking about for some time, which I think is relevant as a bit of a yardstick for what to aim for policy when it comes to development. So the three zeros, he talks about zero poverty, so we've got to keep an eye on what's going on there. Zero net carbon emission, a proxy for the fact that we have to be stewards of the environment, otherwise it comes to back to haunt you. And then zero concentration, whether it's concentration of wealth, concentration of power. This zero concentration is something that I think is hugely important. When I look at the anatomy of corruption at a retail level, it occurs when a public official has huge concentration of power in that moment, when someone, usually a poor citizen, requires that permit, requires that license in that moment, and has no recourse if the official doesn't respond in time. Those concentrations of power we need to do away with. And then finally, to link back to what Nick was saying, and actually everyone else was saying, that the investment imperative requires, as a necessary condition, structural reforms. We don't have any ammunition on the monetary policy front. You can't print your way out of this anymore. There's very little by way of tax rises that you can do. So what do structural reforms mean? It means injecting more dynamism. It's removing regulations that are not fit for purpose, introducing digitalization, not only to enhance efficiency, but also to remove those manual processes that breed corruption. And you could get more more revenue for the government without just focusing on taxes, because at the moment we not only tax people's money, we tax people's energies, we tax their hopes, and we tax their dreams in their day-to-day operations because of the way government operates. And then finally, I think if we get this right, as you know, this interim government is there mainly to enact structural reforms. If we get it right, then I think Bangladesh will be a prototype for basically an ESG investment in the way it was intended to be, because of the uplift of standards that we're going to see on the environmental, social, and governance side of things.
All right, as a minister, maybe you would like to respond to that.
Thank you very much, Siddiqui. And I think you really hit the point home that corruption is a major issue that countries, developing countries, have to deal with. But you also gave the answer, and it's exactly what's being done in Nigeria and no doubt elsewhere. When you move from a regime of subsidies, of administered allocation of resources and of permits, and you move to a market-based system. In Nigeria, we move to market pricing of petroleum products instead of subsidies. We move to market pricing of foreign exchange instead of a discretionary and allocative mechanism. And so all the corruption and disincentives linked to that disappear. And of course, in this, the other important area that you, Siddiqui, mentioned, automation. Automation not only gives you the additional resources to government that they should collect, but also, of course, it limits manual processes. So I think, as you've said, Siddiqui, in particular, that is the path. And that really is the path that Nigeria is on. What I would also like to mention, in terms of what Lord Stern and Mr. Massoud has also mentioned, the urgency of the flow of investments. It has to be the right type of investment, but it must come, and it must come now. And in that sense, when you talk about trust as well, when we look at what is happening in terms of the flow of concessional financing, development aid, there is a negative flow. Funds, the resources that are flowing back as a result of payments of debt service and so forth are larger than the new flows coming. So that really is turning things on its head. And what's the answer? Rather than complaining, the answer has to be domestic resource mobilization, attracting domestic investment, putting in place the conditions that encourage private investment, both of domestic investors and foreign investors, because that clearly is the starting point of our move to development, to growth, and reduction of poverty.
Okay, I would like to move straight to both of you gentlemen, Lord Stern as well as Mr. Massoud Ahmad. I would like to quote from Sir Paul Collier of Blavatnik School of Government in his latest book, Left Behind. I quote, he said, "We need something that enables us to move beyond economic orthodoxies that have helped us for generations." So from your perspective, what are the new ideas or even that should be given a chance or even a latitude to put on trial?
I think we now have an imperative around investment, the investment necessary to build a sustainable, resilient and inclusive path of growth. And we have to look at that directly. And we have to ask the question, how can government act to promote the kind of dynamics of investment and structural change that are necessary? So it's a question about fostering investment, the conditions for investment, the kind of investment. And if you look at development economics courses, I don't think they start that way. And if you look at the way in which a lot of policy has been discussed, it's not really been about the delivery of that kind of investment. And I think you've heard actually all of us on this panel here turn directly to that. And it has to be public policy as if time matters. If you look at the way we teach the economics of policy, often it's saying, here's an equilibrium in the current state of affairs, here's an equilibrium with some policy enacted. If we compare the two, if the second one looks better than the first, then we justify the policy that way. It's a kind of sort of broad, but in some respects, but narrow in others, cost-benefit analysis. The narrowness is about the dynamics and the time. We have to have public policies if time matters. So we have to have the objectives, the getting behind the Sustainable Development Goals. We have to put investment and the conditions for investment at center stage, with private sector investment being the majority of that investment. And we have to think about the dynamics and the paths in ways that we haven't done before. And I think if we do that, then we will have the kind of new approach to economics that Paul described. But we don't throw away some of the babies with the bathwater. I mean, the role of markets in driving decisions and driving investment decisions should be central. Makes no sense to throw that away. But we do have to think about making those markets work much better, as actually everyone on the panel, you know, particularly those involved directly in policy making now, you're thinking about the way in which markets work and getting them to work better. So when we see ways of looking forward which are new, and particularly around the dynamics and the investment, we have to make sure that some of the insights that we carry with us from economics are not lost. So we have to change things very sharply, but not turn everything upside down.
Mr. Harper.
Let me make, we're also going to run out of time, so let me make two very quickly points that actually go in different directions, slightly contradictory. The first point is, I think what you've heard from both Lutfi Siddiqui and the Minister is a recognition that the conditions under which economic activity takes place, investment happens, returns are made, is as important as the financing itself. That, and I think the governance, the incentive structures, all of that. And I think the fact that you're both saying that is really important for me, because that is a message that I think people need to hear loud and clear. The contradictory point I want to make is that money does matter. And particularly, if you think about the investment surge that Nick's just been making a passionate case for, the central thing about the green transition, the new development strategy, is that it substitutes, in energy in particular, a flow of spending over time with an upfront investment in renewable sources. It's capital intensive. Yeah. And if the cost of capital is too high, the same project which is very profitable in Germany is not profitable in Nigeria. And so we have to find ways to make long-term financing on affordable terms key if we want to go from talking about this transition to making it happen. And there, I just want to end by saying, look, we have an instrument. When the world created the development banks, national and multilateral, they are the best way of leveraging small amounts of money. The World Bank's total capital that governments have put into it is $20-some billion over 80 years. They have lent $850 billion worth of long-term loans from that $20 billion. Where else will you get this kind of leveraging in the world that doesn't fall apart, sustainable? So I would just say we have an instrument, a range of these institutions. We can quickly ramp up long-term financing. We should stop talking about the importance of it, which is what every international gathering does, and actually say, okay, let's get some of this done in the next 2 years.
Money does matter. It's not one size fits all. Ms. Musako.
I agree with that completely. What I'd like to add is, we should not discount the the importance, as you're saying, of institutions on the continent, which is the development finance institutions that are also well governed. So they, actually address the issues around governance as well. We also have institutional capacity when it comes to pension funds across the continent. I mean, one of the key instruments that was put in place in Nigeria, for example, was infra credit that was set up to actually enable institutional funds to flow, a model that we're also replicating elsewhere in the country to accelerate infrastructure development, as you have mentioned. One of the key items on the G20 agenda is the global financial architecture, and that, at the core of that is addressing the issue around the cost of funds, addressing the issues around perception of risk, which can be closed by actually, closing the data gap around, default rates and those elements on the continent. And, with the theme of the G20 for South Africa, where the theme is solidarity, equality, and sustainability, we are really expected that action will be taken, even by the MDBs, not only to address this issue, but to also commit to local currency financing in the jurisdictions that they operate. I'm of the view that with all of these elements being addressed, issues around collaboration, cost of funds, Africa as a region, and the governance issues as well. Africa as a region will really is well positioned to take advantage of the green growth economy.
Mr. Edwin.
Thank you. I would just like to end by echoing what Mr. Masood Ahmed has said. Money does matter. And I said earlier, the flow is negative to developing countries, for the Bangladeshis, for the Nigerias, and other developing countries that are following the right policies. The big difference is access to concessional finance. As Mr. Masood and even Lord Stan said, there are transactions which can only be done if you have the right pricing of capital. We are focused on equity capital, on foreign direct investment, on domestic investment, but we need that concessional funding as well in order to be able to implement our development plans. Thank you.
So I agree that we do need more funding, more concessional funding, better pricing of that funding, better terms of that funding. But I don't think it's either or. Money matters, but governance matters as well. And the risk pricing for these countries, we have as much of an obligation to get the story right and then sell the story right in order to affect the pricing of that. I don't think we should deflect from our need to make governance improvements. I look at Malaysia, for example. I mean, just in the last 12 months, amazing investments in data centers, semiconductors, that sort of stuff. So there are some really good stories where you can turn vicious cycles into virtuous cycles. I would hope that all of you would essentially act as reforms watch in countries like Nigeria and Bangladesh as well, so that you hold our feet to the fire, whoever is representing our countries at the next Davos. Make sure that we deliver reforms that are felt by investors, by people, by citizens at the retail level, because that really is as much of an imperative as is the investment imperative.
Okay, we run out of time. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mr. Sako. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm not going to conclude this session because we are about to rewrite. So we cannot jump to conclusion without starting from the first page, right? So thank you very much for watching. For those watching online, keep pushing. Continue our discussion with regards to find sustainable and equitable.
Very interesting conversation there. We'll go on a quick break. When we come back, we'll bring to you more stories here on News Now.